What is up, Team Eternal? Welcome to another EPL Eternal Logos podcast. We are back in the studio like we normally are, having guests in and trying to get some good content to everybody. I'm so glad you guys are tuned in. This has been a great month. It's kind of sticking towards the goal of doing 2 a month. We'll kind of see what happens in the month of May, but today I think is the 25th, if I'm not mistaken. And so we hit the quota for April, so good things to come in May. Today, I have a very special guest, my friend Kara. We met not too long ago in the gym, another gym buddy. She's amazing, by the way, in the gym. Another beast on the podcast, here to give us some some good talks and chats and all of that good stuff. As always, I'll give her a chance to introduce herself. And she's actually one of the first guests, actually the first guest to actually give the topic on air. And I've been kind of picking and prodding to see if I can get her to tell me, but she has stuck to her guns, and that is amazing. So this is going to be a great episode for everybody. Hopefully everybody has had a good year so far, by the way. That year has been pretty good, and so we're going to continue that and continue to content to everybody. So without further ado, we're going to introduce Kara. We're going to get started with the content. And I don't have any announcements to make that I don't think of at the moment. Yeah. All right. Yes. So this is my friend Kara McDuff.
Hello.
Want to introduce yourself? Give yourself a moment to kind of just tell us. Maybe we can do where you're from, what your favorite color is. She told me a minute ago, and then if you want to plug any social media, at all. Yeah.
I'm Kara, and my favorite color is blue. I was born in Florida, pretty much raised here in Georgia. My social media is some_Amica, and it's quite small, but it's just a lot of fitness stuff. So
If you check it out, you will agree with me that she is a gym goer and she knows what she's doing in there. So
I just try.
Yeah. Okay, so I normally like to start off, and you guys know if you tune into the podcast, and has watched my podcast and she's very familiar with it, and I am eternally grateful for everybody and eternally grateful for her for watching and tuning in. So she knows we like to ask what your worldview is, because that's a major key component of what we do. So what's your worldview, Kara?
So oddly enough, I knew you were going to ask this, and I did not prepare for it. So I have to think for a second, because it is very important.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people say that they're Christian, which I am.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really like to use that as a defining term because it can mean so many different things to many people.
Yeah.
So my worldview is, I think I would probably be able to best describe it as we're all just trying to do the best that we can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody is looking for a sense of purpose and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And worth, and
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like what everybody's after at the core.
Yeah.
Of what they decide.
And I forgot to turn the hourglass. I don't think you guys saw this last time, but that is the hourglass we're going to be using to kind of keep track of time. I think it's a pretty nice touch. So would you say, okay, so Christian is a founding element there. I get that has, and this is maybe this will be the topic today. I don't know. But maybe this will certainly probably come up in other episodes. But just Christian as a term, being religious, right? A lot of people I think today have take issue with religion as a word, so to speak, right? I'm not necessarily saying that that's what you're claiming, but I get where you're coming from with that for sure. So Christian foundation. And you said everybody's kind of doing the best that they can and kind of figure out sort of the fulfillment, purpose, and all of those things. So how would you, in one word or a phrase, how would you say, how do you think that defines you? Would you say like your worldview is Christian, but trying to, say, be the best version of yourself in some way that if somebody walked away from hearing you say that, what would they think about your worldview? Like Kara told me she was blank.
Well, like worldview is the lens with which I view the world, right?
Yep.
So the lens that I view the world is that everybody's trying to do the best that they can.
Mm-hmm.
And my part in that is also I'm doing the best that I can, but I think that part of my purpose is to help other people be able to do that.
Mm.
So.
Yeah, okay.
Does that make sense?
Perfect. Yes.
Man, you started off like hard with just the simple question.
And she said she knew I was going to ask, but she wasn't prepared.
I know, because I wasn't thinking about that part.
Wait, cool. All right. The topic. Drum roll, please. Yeah, what is the topic?
Do you want to guess? Or no?
I feel like I tried to guess, but I've been failing.
Yeah. So, the topic that I wanted to just explore, because I am by no means like an expert on this. I'm still trying to figure it all out myself. So, I think a good way to do that is conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's kind of twofold.
Mm-hmm.
So I came up with boundaries and vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
and how they relate together.
Okay.
But not just in the context of like relationships, because a lot of times if you hear people talk about boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
you automatically think boundaries with other people and in relationships. But I think about it a lot in the context of a relationship with yourself.
Yeah.
How would you define boundaries within yourself, vulnerability within yourself, like how you relate to yourself? Because ultimately, I think that is the most important component when you're going to come to a relationship of any kind.
Yes.
It could be with a partner, it could be with your child or a coworker. You have to have a good relationship with yourself
Mm-hmm.
in order to have a good relationship with other people.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that's the playground.
Yeah, okay. I like it. So many different places we could go with this, and so we will explore it for sure. Start with a definition. How would you define boundary?
See, that's a very good question. I think there's two different kinds of boundaries. I think there are external boundaries that say, this is the line in the sand. I am not okay with, we'll take like murder. If I get so mad at somebody, I will never cross that line. That boundary is I'm never going to kill that person if I get mad at them.
Yeah.
Kind of as an extreme example. But I also think that there's internal boundaries. And those boundaries can be, I know if I'm tired, I get cranky. So I need to create an internal boundary. One, that I'm going to get enough sleep. Two, if I am cranky, I'm not going to act out of that crankiness. I'm going to have self-awareness to know how to properly create boundaries within my internal world.
Yeah.
So that I can remain in integrity with myself.
Yeah.
And feel confident with myself and my own decisions.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It for sure does. I think it kind of touches a little bit on, and you saw this episode as well with Mercy and Rachel. By the way, she knows Mercy and Rachel.
I do.
And so we were talking a lot. The topic was, are you what you attract, more or less, right? And I think we kind of touched a little bit on boundaries. You said some interesting stuff there, which we'll obviously return to. But I'm interested to know what you think is, how do external boundaries and internal boundaries, how would you prioritize them, right? Do you think one's more important than the other? Do you think one has to precede the other? Or do you think that they're equally important and you have to develop them at the same time? Is that even possible to develop them at the same time? Given, sort of socially how we grow up. Right? You grew up in a household with parents and you're influenced by your surroundings, those kinds of things, right? And so, what do you think about that?
I think that boundaries, internal and external, are rooted in our value system.
Worldview.
It's so complex when you start talking about worldview because it's so hard to condense it down into like one filter.
Yeah.
Because you can have like shades, like transition lenses, like I can see the world right now and there's so much going on. I might need the lens to be darker or I might need it to be lighter. It depends on where I'm at and what I'm doing. So,
Yep.
But anyways, that's worldview. I think the boundaries to the external or internal come first. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, or would you, if you were teaching someone or mentoring someone and the lesson of boundaries was to come up, right? Would you say, for instance, that you think developing internal boundaries should come first?
I'm not sure that it can. Because because in order to be able to set internal boundaries, you have to be able to know yourself. You have to be able to know what you value. And I think that's actually an ongoing process, like in life.
Yeah.
But it's easier to set external boundaries. I think as a young kid, we're taught, you don't do X, Y, Z. You don't hit people. You don't steal things,
Right.
So that societal influence is there, teaching you right from wrong. I wasn't raised in the church, but I know a lot of people are, and so you can get a value system instilled starting from a very young age.
Yeah.
I think it might come first, just because
That's gonna be my question. Yeah.
Self-development
Yeah.
happens.
Right.
Parts of our brain aren't even developed fully until we're in our 20s.
Right.
So I think, external boundaries first.
But would you say, technically, that internal boundaries are developed first? Because, for instance, how would you know what external boundaries to set if you don't necessarily have internal boundaries to rely on? How would you gauge developing an external boundary, right? And so there is part of it that's okay, when you're a kid, like you said, teaching kids to share might be something, or teaching kids when it's appropriate to share or when it's appropriate to not share, right? And obviously that can be a weird kind of thing, but something's instilled in a kid that teaches them, or at least a foundational principle might teach them why that's important, so that they can relate back to that and see why it's important moving forward in their life. But when you're an adult and you're developing boundaries in a relationship or a friendship or at work, you're relying on something as a gauge, like you said, worldview and a value system. But there is something in you that maybe you might have learned to convict yourself to, right? They say, how can someone love you if you don't love yourself, kind of thing, right? So does that take, you know what I mean? So I'm only challenging a little bit to see if I can get you to change your mind. No, I'm kidding. but you know what I mean, though, right? If
I'm trying to understand the question.
Okay, so you said external boundaries come first.
I think.
So you're saying that external boundaries, it's a conscious effort in a person to develop external boundaries first, or developing boundaries in your own mind is something that develops subconsciously, right?
So
through environment, family, worldview, other things, right?
And your experiences. I think to maybe further clarify internal boundaries, I mean in a way that I would relate to myself. So if I've had a hard day and I come home and I'm stressed and I'm hungry, I have to create a boundary within myself to say, I acknowledge that I've had a hard day. I acknowledge that I'm really hungry. And I acknowledge that my thoughts right now are not what I would choose to operate out of. So then I have to create that boundary for myself and say, no, I'm not going to treat myself that way. I'm going to give myself grace. I'm going to go home and I'm going to eat. And I'm going to lay my head down for 15 minutes. And I'm going to take proper care of myself so that I don't continue in this funk. So that's kind of what I meant by internal boundaries.
Okay, yeah.
And I can set those internal boundaries because of a value that I've attached to my life.
Yeah.
And I think that value comes from God's love.
Right.
So I think external boundaries are ingrained in us. We do get to choose them. They come from values I value integrity, I value discipline, I value love, I value kindness, I value these things. And so you can kind of set external boundaries, say, I'm not going to do drugs in my life. I'm not going to go here.
Okay.
But on the internal boundary side, it's how I relate to myself. And I think...
That's super sophisticated, by the way.
Is it?
Yeah, because I didn't even think about it that way. I was thinking external boundaries in terms of how people treat you or how you allow them to treat you, but that's in the context of a relationship. But you're just saying just self, internal, external.
Yes.
Look at that. Super sophisticated. I love it. I thought I'd do anything. Yeah, go ahead.
There we
Sorry,
go.
I might have cut you off there.
No, you're good. So now the question is what?
So the framework has certainly changed and the context has changed a bit. Okay, so external boundaries comes first, and you said that external boundaries are sort of an intake of values, like how you're, the thing that you are kind of relating to as a value to find, to say like, okay, well, I think this is something that I want to become a part of who I am as a person. Internal boundary, and just make sure I got it right, is sort of how you treat yourself, what you allow yourself to sort of accept about yourself. Okay.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like I said in the beginning, I haven't got all this figured out.
Yeah, no,
like
it's
something
perfect.
that I play around with in my mind too, and it's a way to kind of help me walk more authentically.
Yeah.
To be more in tune with myself.
Yeah.
And that brings in the vulnerability piece.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really, you can't separate vulnerability from boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
It takes somebody being vulnerable, like within self, to accept parts that we normally don't want to accept, even about ourselves.
Yeah.
To be able to say, okay, I can open myself, I can be seen, I can see myself.
Right.
And then from that place, I can then set those boundaries.
Right. Okay. And I'm going to follow, because it's like I said, I've never thought about boundaries in that context. I think when people think boundaries, right, like people normally think obviously it's with other people.
Exactly.
Right. When you say internal boundaries, I'm like, okay, yeah, well, that's self-conviction at some level, right? Like what you allow yourself, but both of them are related to self and don't necessarily have to do with other people, right? So if you had to say, just to make sure we have a good foundation before we move forward, so internal boundaries is, like if you had say it in a short phrase.
An internal boundary is short phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Like if you like how you treat yourself, what you allow yourself to, you know what I'm saying?
I would say an internal boundary is what you accept as far as how I treat myself, how I talk to myself, how I take care of myself, but also how I will not treat myself, how I will not talk to myself. So it is setting those parameters in the same way I would set a parameter in a relationship. No, you're not going to yell at me when you're mad. We'll have a conversation later inside. I'm not going to talk to myself right now in that manner. I'm going to figure out what I need to get back to my neutral ground.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
That was not short. I am sorry.
No, it's okay. No, that's good. It's good clarity. I think people are going to comment on this. I think this is a good one. Because again,
I'm just glad I stumped. You didn't even see it coming.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
Yes.
And an external boundary is?
An external boundary is similar. It is, I am not going to allow myself to be treated in this way, but I'm also not going to treat you in a certain way. It's just setting those parameters of what's okay and what's not okay.
And then you also said something about values and what you take in as a value, right? So I kind of, in my mind, when I think about that is like, and this is normally, I guess it happens when you're younger and as a kid as well too, right? But when you're young, the influence of your parents and the people around you is so great that you don't necessarily feel like you're making your own choices about what you decide is a value for you. Right? I think some kids probably did it a little bit, and you're exploring a little bit as a kid, but when you get older, that becomes more apparent. Like there's certain things, especially when you experience relationships and those kinds of things, right? Like you start to really think about whether the way you're being treated is something that you should take in as being a means of moving forward in your life, right? So you said something about values, and I think that was really cool and interesting to think about it that way. And so when it comes to building relationships, what kind of boundary is it? Because the word choices, right, like it's really good. So when someone's coming into your life, you're building a relationship, what would you call that kind of a boundary when you're setting boundaries around a person or between two people, or right, like when you're trying to teach somebody how to treat you? Does that go by a different name? Like, says internal boundary, external boundary relative to self, and then is there internal and external boundaries relative to relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if I understand the question correctly, I think that they are the same, but they just have to be communicated.
Right.
So I don't really know what else I would call it. It would just be vulnerability.
Right. So so you can basically, so you have internal boundaries relative to self. When someone is entering your life and you're building a relationship, you can communicate and educate a person on what your internal and external boundaries are.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that takes vulnerability, because you have to not only on the inside be willing to be seen, show up and be seen by yourself. You have to allow somebody else to see you and your boundaries, but just in authenticity. Like, these are things I struggle with, and that just comes out over time. It's not like it has to be upfront and all right, list them out. Let's get a whiteboard.
Yeah.
Let's hash everything out. I think.
Well, that's actually a good question. What do you think is the most appropriate way? Like, do you think it's appropriate to list? Do you think it's appropriate to list out? Because I think in culture today, like, it can be a little bit of there are a lot of things that are unspoken, and I think there's an expectation that things are unspoken. Right? Like, I think if you, for instance, say, like, I think about this all the time. Like, if I had a roommate, right, when people have roommates, I think sometimes, or let's just say that roommate's close to you, let's say it's a best friend or a family member, right? I think when you get into situations like that, there are a lot of things that are kind of expected between the relationship that you have as a roommate that you don't necessarily always communicate. And then and I've seen this happen before, when it's time to communicate them, it's a hesitation, because it's like, well, it's kind of silly to kind of come up with like a dishes schedule. You know what I mean? Because in the mind, it's just like, well, the dishes need to be done. Somebody will do them, right? But then it's just like, okay, well, nobody's doing them. And then it becomes an argument at some point. You know what I mean? Then it's like, okay, well, now we need a schedule, right? And so I use that as an analogy and a premise to say, like, do you think it's appropriate to, when you first start to build a relationship, to set boundaries immediately? It might be list form. That might be necessary.
I think, yes. I think that
it can be weird and challenging, because it's like, I don't want to just put too much on you at first, but it might be necessary. It might be useful, right?
It might be. To use the dishes analogy, I think that if I were to have a roommate and the expectation would be that they would do the dishes on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and I would do them Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we would alternate, but that was never communicated, then when it doesn't get done, there has to be a conversation.
Right.
Everybody brings assumptions into things.
Exactly.
So then to have the ability to clarify what those expectations are, you might not need to do it up front. It might work. The roommate might do the dishes Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then you do them Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and it might work because it just does. Some things do align like that.
Right.
But if they don't, and you don't say anything, I would say that's an internal boundary issue that you have to solve first, and then you can take.
Like, okay, so walk me through this real fast. So, like, okay, let's just say, and I'm thinking, okay, so let's go from initial. Let's just say, like, okay, person I'm friends with, we're going to become roommates, right? Month one, right? There's going to be some nonverbal expectations set, right? Like, and if you're the homeowner, I think there's probably more expectations that you have on the other person, but the other person has living habits, right? They've developed some boundaries in and of themselves that you're going to now have to face, right? Yeah. So let's just say initial or step one, it's like, okay, well, we're roommates now. We're a month in. We're noticing that there is some disturbances in our connection, in the force, so to speak. Like, things aren't going as I expected.
Disturbance.
Yes. And so now we're at the level, okay, so let's say first, is it okay, or not necessarily okay, but do you think it's important to day one to give a list of boundaries?
If somebody's about to move in my space, yes. Yes.
Would you encourage that for people? Would you be like, yes? Would you tell people?
Yes, I think it is more uncomfortable to get to a place where you have conflict.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you can set expectations early on, then it's easier to manage the conflict if it does arise, because the expectation has already been set.
Right.
There's no, well, you didn't tell me, I didn't know, kind of thing. So if somebody is about to move in and I'm going to be roommates with somebody, we're going to have to discuss the rent. We're going to have to discuss all of the practicalities, all of the external things that matter.
Right.
So.
Okay, so we have a list. So you said Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So those are how we break it up, right? And then, okay, let's just say that it's not followed. Oh no, before that. Let's just say you're noticing that your roommate is perpetrating on their days and not doing them right. Is it self-evaluation at your point as an internal manager to see if that's an acceptable thing, right? So we're kind of levels down here where it's just like, okay, I noticed that there's something that we agreed upon that's happening, that's not happening. Do you then go into your mind like, okay, is this an acceptable betrayal of our contract, or is it something I'd immediately address, right? Obviously, that would probably be different for each person, but is that kind of what you think when you say, now it's time to reevaluate your boundary and see if that's something that's acceptable?
Yes. However, if the expectation and the agreement by both parties was, this is the boundary, this is the schedule, and then that's breached, there has to be a conversation. Because if you accept somebody slipping past that boundary and not addressing it, I think that, number one, they're going to continue to do it, and it could breed resentment. And if you don't have that conversation, it's gonna affect how you feel about yourself too, because you had an agreement, somebody's not holding that agreement, and you're letting them get away with it. So I would then be losing integrity with myself.
It's an interesting concept. We can go down the road, but let's stay where we are real fast.
Okay.
If I remember that, because that's an interesting component there.
Okay, go
ahead.
Well, I think it matters, even in the little things like that, because we have our subconscious, and it's always listening, it's always processing, and how we treat ourselves. So the little infractions that we continue to let, affect us, I think that it can, if it's just dishes, it's not that big of a deal, but it could be something over a longer period of time or something bigger than that.
Yeah.
And we have to address it.
Yeah. Okay, so you would evaluate your boundary. You would say, this is not okay. I need to communicate this to my roommate, right? Then it becomes a communication thing, a boundary that you're now going to set with your roommate and decide whether, if this is if there's a resolvable conflict or not, right? You're going to kind of go into an engagement of conversation with them, right? So do you know or have experienced if a boundary is broken or there's a boundary that's overstepped by another person, do you ever think it's a time when it's okay?
Yes. I think a lot of times also when we think of boundary, we think of this is a very firm and fixed boundary. But I think boundaries are also how much of myself do I give. So in the example of the dishes, if I know my roommate just lost their best friend and their dog has cancer,
right,
and they're stressed at work, and they don't get the dishes done, I'm not going to say, this is a problem for me because the boundary was you're supposed to do dishes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday,
Yeah.
the boundary is never, it was never firm anyways. It was how much am I okay with giving, what is okay and what is not. And at that time, this is okay.
Right.
This is not. But if I then have new information, something changes, I have to reevaluate that and say, okay, I know you're going through a hard time. I've got the dishes for the whole next month.
Yeah.
You know, I'm here for you. That would be communicated.
Yeah. Do you think some people are better than others at doing that?
I definitely think some people are better at that than others. Like,
you step into the realm of relationships, right? Like, it's like some people are better, and I think this is probably like difference between men and women. If we were to bring that up as a part of this, right? Like, women tend to be more nurturing, right? So in a situation like that, it might be an expectation. Speaking of roommates, like if it's a roommate, a man and a woman, you might have a situation where the woman's going to be more empathetic, right? In those situations, doesn't necessarily have to be. Men can be very empathetic and emotionally intelligent.
I would say healthy masculinity does involve empathy.
Yes, I agree. But like, okay, so that makes sense. Some people are going to probably be better at it, but that's also something that can be projected. I think this might be an interesting point to bring up when we're talking about boundaries, internal, external, how you communicate them out. People obviously come from different walks of life and they may have set different boundaries, but I think in certain situations we can then project our expectations of what our boundaries are onto someone else. So in an instance where it might be they had a hard day or they're wrestling with something that's internal to them and really, right? Is it okay, the expectation that, because this is where it gets really nuanced, right? It's like, if you don't show empathy, are you wrong for not showing empathy? You're just like, well, do the dishes. It's your day. Because I think some people will take that and think like, well, you can be understanding kind of thing, right? And so this kind of gets even more complicated, right? I think the podcast is dedicated to discovering truths about reality, right? And I think this is a very real reality where I expect people to be empathetic in certain situations, in certain scenarios. But do they have to be, right? And understanding that we do come from different walks of life and we do have different boundaries, that might be an expectation that might be reasonable or it might not be reasonable, right? So, like, what do you think about that?
I think it depends on the other person in the relationship. Because if they are struggling, it's also on them to be able to come to the table and say, I'm struggling. This is what I need. Which is
a boundary, an internal boundary. They have to.
It is. It takes
understanding.
It takes two healthy people to have a healthy relationship.
Right.
So if that person is self-aware and that person has done some inner work and is, has those internal boundaries and can say, I need to set this boundary because I'm not doing good. In a relationship, you have to communicate that. So I think the other person, if they're like, suck it up, buttercup, do the dishes, then that is wrong. If that person says, this is what I need right now, and they have, nope, that's my boundary, then I think there needs to be a bigger conversation because that issue isn't going to go away. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. It brings up other questions though, right? Because, and not that I'm disagreeing, I think I'm meaning to bring up these nuances because I think these are real life scenarios and situations. And like we said, expectations are a big thing, right? Like we just go places and we just expect certain ways of being treated in those things, right? And I don't think many people stop to really think about all of the nuances, right? Like, and I think having conversations like this, right, which is a great thing, can help to bring light to these kinds of scenarios because they can happen instantaneously, right? And I think that's obviously where relationships break down because people don't think about like, okay, well, when's the appropriate time to do this? And it is other things, it's variables, right? Like, okay, like you had a bad day and you don't want to do the dishes. Well, I had a bad day too. All right, but the dishes need to be done. So, like now
rock, paper, scissors.
right. But it's your day, so why do I need to do rock, paper, scissors, right? So
yes, but that's why communication, I think, is
right.
in that nuanced situation. If you both come home and you're like, man, it's takeout night, then nobody has to do the dishes.
Right.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it goes back to relationship to self.
Mm-hmm.
We might tell ourselves a story and be like, well, they need to do the dishes. I had a hard day too.
Yeah.
If they don't do the dishes, then they're not bringing their best self to the table and it doesn't sit right with me. And we begin to tell ourselves a story that might not be the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if that were to be the case and it was my day to do the dishes and I had work to do, if I got home, the dog made a mess, I have to clean up the mess, like laundry for my daughter's band the next day still needs to be done, so she has her uniform, and like I'm completely overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
It would be on me to say, I can't do the dishes today. I got your Wednesday, or I got your Thursday. Can you do my Tuesday? To come up with a solution.
It definitely, yeah. What about when communication breaks down? At what point do you think it's appropriate to sever a relationship tie?
That's a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
That's a whole different conversation.
Yeah. Because in a way, right, there is a part of this that you're saying, like, there's boundaries, but there's some malleability in your boundaries and the boundaries that you set, right? And that's going to be based off of some other factors. It'll be based off of some values, right? So, for instance, if you value compassion and you value empathy as a value, then it would make sense in those moments. Communicate. You can find a compromise. I can take one of your days. I'll do your dishes this day, etc. But what if someone doesn't value empathy at the same level, right? Or they think that the contract's the contract, right? And we're talking about between friends, right? There's business relationships. There's all kinds of things, right? And so there seems to be some malleability in, what you convict yourself to from a boundary perspective. And I'm trying to come up with tough scenarios or at least when it's appropriate to do that versus when it's not appropriate to do that. Or at least the best time to not be flexible in your boundary, right? Yeah. When the situation is not like dire, it's just not like, oh, this person's abusing me kind of a situation. It's like, no, stick to your boundaries. But if it's just a situation like dishes, which is like, oh, this is not really a big deal.
Yeah.
But who knows, it could be a big deal to somebody.
If it's happening every single week.
Yeah.
For months, like where do you draw the line?
Right.
That would definitely be something that would probably be different for every person. For me, it would depend on how the other person is getting through whatever it is that they're struggling with. If they, I don't know. It's hard to put like 2 weeks, that's all you got.
Yeah.
4 weeks, that's all you got.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to put that number, like to say this is when I would cut it off because there's no way to predict that,
Yeah.
I really don't know how to answer that.
And I think that honestly is really the hardest part, I think, when you talk about relationships and boundaries. It's like, when is it appropriate to be objective? Right.
When it's no longer being reciprocated. If it's no longer being reciprocated.
Yeah.
If there's no longer an effort on the other person's part to have that healthy communication, then that's the big problem.
Are you saying like when it's like so for instance, let's just say week 1, they're having a bad day. It's a Wednesday. It was your night. I'll take this one, no problem, right? Week 2, it's a Wednesday. Okay, like maybe it lingered, you know what I'm saying, last week. Okay, I'll take it. I get it, right? You're having a hard day. week 3, on your side, you're like, all right, you're crossing one of my boundaries because we have these days for a reason, right? Exactly. And then you're like, okay, well, now you're molding. Will be like, okay, at what point am I going to say, okay, am I going to give it a time limit? Am I going to talk to them and get some more information to see how long this might last? That kind of thing. Yeah. And then there is the breakdown, the intentional stoppage of communication by the other party. Right? Like, is that what you meant when you said, like, when communication or the desire to communicate is no longer reciprocated? I don't know if you use the desire to communicate as a phrase, but that's kind of what I thought of when you said that, the breakdown of communication.
Right.
Is that kind of what you mean? Like, which I think would definitely be fair. It's like, well, you don't even want to talk about it. Rude.
Right.
Like,
yeah, if you can't have communication about things and you both are working towards a common goal, then it shows a lack of respect for the other person, I think. And as somebody who's, developed a healthy respect for myself, there is going to be a time where if you're not going to respect me, then I have enough respect for myself to say this is no longer working for me. And it just really, it's hard to take such a complex issue and put it into dishes.
Yeah, I know. It's like the lightest, hardest thing we can think of, which I think is appropriate, though.
It is, because usually in relationships, the little things are the things that add up.
Exactly.
Yes, and it does.
And if you compromise the little things, the big things will follow for sure.
Yeah. Yep. So it's important to talk about the little things, but if it comes to when do you decide a relationship is no longer working, that's like what I said, it's like a whole nother topic. Yeah. Because it really does come down to internal boundaries, what you're okay with. Yeah. And what you're not okay with. Yeah. So that's kind of a little bit harder to discuss over dishes. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so let's flip it. Okay. Dishes was just a lighthearted thing. Yeah. What about abuse in relationships, right? And I think it's important to talk about this because it's really something that a lot of people suffer from. Yeah. Abuse comes at multiple levels, physical, verbal, et cetera, et cetera. Some people have told themselves in some way, shape, or form that a toxic relationship, that abuse is okay, right? And I find that to be it's an interesting and weird psychology, but I think a lot of people do suffer from that in many ways. What like in thinking about boundaries? It's like if you're in a situation where there's abuse, right? And maybe we can take a step back. Are there boundaries set that are not good boundaries? Let's say that. Like, would you call, for instance, if someone thinks like perseverance through abuse, right? Like, right? Oh, like if I stay, you know what I mean? Like this can turn into something good, kind of thing. Right. If you love them enough. Yeah. Kind of thing, where you end up making excuses for their behavior rather than holding them accountable. So I've experienced it, and it's horrible because you lose yourself in the process, and it's hard to find your voice back after you've been in something like that. So when it comes to boundaries, it's not necessarily that you set bad ones. It's that you don't set boundaries. You don't protect yourself. And instead you make excuses for other people. You make excuses for their behavior. You think it's going to get better. And a lot of times abuse isn't like every day you're getting black eyes. Or it's some days are good, some days are bad. Yeah. So you try to hold out on this like false hope of everything's going to be better, right? Right. So... And then, even though I wasn't raised in the church, there was a time that I was in the church. And there was a lot of, you just have to keep forgiving. You just have to keep loving. Right. You just have to persevere. Yeah. You have all of these values that are good,
That's what I was going to ask you.
but when you apply them to an abusive situation and there's no accountability for the other person, you will give and give and give and give until you have lost yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where those internal boundaries come into play, where you now say, I actually value these things, perseverance and love and joy and kindness, but I'm not giving them to myself.
Yeah.
So
do you think it's the good qualities, the good values that should inform your boundary setting? Because like you were saying, like for instance, if you like value forgiveness, right? That you develop a certain psychology around that idea, and so you start to think or hold the position that forgiveness is the way to move forward with this person who's abusing me, right? And then you're right, like you clearly haven't set an appropriate boundary between the thing you value and what you're experiencing, right? And I think that's kind of what you're saying when you said there is a loss of self there, because you're like, well, you're not including yourself as an agent, an important agent in this scenario or situation. So like, what would you tell somebody if like they were using a value like that? You said false hope, for instance. Like, how would you get them to recognize that what they're going through is not something that they shouldn't use that good value as a means to support being treated poorly? And then how would you like tell them like, whoa,
first of all, I'm not a therapist.
Yeah. You know, good advice is good advice nonetheless.
I would, that's really hard.
Yeah.
It is very hard to get somebody who's in an abusive situation to realize that they're not doing that person any good, they're not doing themselves any good, and it's hard to convince them otherwise. I think there has to be like almost like a rock bottom that they would have to get to and realize that I can't live like this anymore. That's hard. I don't really know what I would tell somebody in a situation like that.
Yeah.
I definitely don't think I would tell them, keep up the good fight.
Right.
I'm praying for you. All of those things would not be helpful.
Yeah.
They need to be seen. They need to know that, number one, that they're not alone, because that's a very containing thing to feel like you're all alone in this, and the shame associated with, wow, even if I recognize this is a bad situation, I'm now ashamed. I don't want anybody to know.
Right.
So being able to hold space for somebody and say, you're not alone, can help take some of the power of the shame away.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably going to be the most crucial component, is not giving them advice, but letting them know that they have value and that whatever they're going through, that they can get out of it, that there is a way. But it starts with self.
Right.
Because even if they leave, they've got some work to do.
Right. Yeah.
Because a lot of times they go back. People who are in abusive situations, they might leave, but then they go back.
Right. I'm trying to think of what I would say, right? Because I tend to like to, I like to be a help. I like to be useful, right?
Right.
And so I'm trying, so I feel like the first step would be to try to get them to recognize that whatever it is, because I don't think that people naturally, I think people I think that they do naturally actually attach something good to a bad outcome if they're determined, or if their psychology has been formed in such a way where they are willing to remain in this place, if that makes sense. Right. So for instance, you were saying like false hope, right? Like in their heart, they have a value of hopefulness. Situation will change, or they could just be a hopeful person, right? Or if it's the forgiving scenario, forgive them, things may turn around, right? Like, and to be fair, there are some situations where people were forgiving and those situations did turn around. So that's a level, right? But I think I think when abuse starts, right, like people tend to attach some good value there, right? Otherwise, I think it would sort of destroy a person in a sense, right? Like you kind of need something good to hope. It's like being in despair. It's like, you know what I mean? No one thinks that despair is good, right? And so I think that like my first step would be to let them know that the thing that they've attached to the outcome, the value they've attached to the outcome, is not the thing they think that it is, right? For instance, like in my mind, and as a Christian, right, one of the Christian principles of forgiveness, a lot of people forget that what precedes forgiveness is repentance, for instance, right? So I think educating people on what values actually mean, what they are, where they come from, the worldview thing is very important, right? Because if you're not a Christian, you value the ethic of forgiveness, but it's just like, okay, but if you don't have a foundation for your forgiveness, then that might take different shapes and different forms, right? But from a Christian perspective, if you do have that foundation, you can lean on this idea of repentance, as well as when forgiveness is the quality or the thing that we're building from, right? So you start there and you kind of like let them know like, here's why this is not a good situation, because there has to be some repentance in order for there to be true forgiveness in such a way that's going to yield the good result of what forgiveness is intended to do, right? And so I feel like I would start there.
Yeah.
And I think that would probably crack the door open if you can get them to recognize it. That does make some sense, right? Yeah. Obviously, you have to appeal probably to who they are in their worldview in some sense, right? But I think people who are get themselves out of abusive situations ultimately find, like sometimes people like convert to religion or something like that, right? That's kind of like you said, a rock bottom. They kind of hit a rock bottom, and religion comes and helps to support in them it wakes them up to some reality, right, in some way, and it gives them something valuable to hold on to that seems to counteract the damage that might have been done over time in those abusive situations, right? Mm-hmm. And I think those ethics and those values, teaching a person with those ethics and those values actually meaning how you get to good results as opposed to using them as a means to support bad behavior, right? And so I feel like that's where I would start. Does it make sense?
It does make sense, but I think there is even greater value in power in those values and walking in them, because you can tell somebody all day, this is right, this is wrong, so what you gonna do?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But forgiveness, like if you were to teach them about forgiveness, and that everybody knows kind of what forgiveness is, but it's like you said, without repentance, you're forgiving somebody, but they're going to continuously, go against that.
Yeah.
So I lost what I was going to say.
Yeah. You're also saying, like, this is actually a really good biblical point, actually. So I think some people hold the position that, for instance, Jesus forgave in such a way that was just, I just forgive people just because, right? I think the story you point to in the Bible, essentially to kind of get an idea of why this is probably not true, just forgive just because, right, is when he's on the cross, right? One of the last things he says is forgive them because they don't know what they're doing, basically, right? So forgiveness and repentance go hand in hand, right, which is obviously a big principle there, right? Like in order to become Christian, you kind of have to admit your fault and be accountable for what you do and then say, God, I need help, forgive me. And then God comes out and forgives you and gives you help, right? And so when Jesus says forgive them when he's on the cross, right, but they don't know what they're doing, he's saying forgive them because they don't know. But somebody who does know what they're doing, and you forgive them just because, you're basically saying what you did to me doesn't matter.
Well, right. I think what he was saying was forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. They didn't know that they were actually crucifying God.
Right, exactly.
So, like, if they actually knew
right.
that they were crucifying their own Savior,
right.
they probably wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So I think that's kind of what, like you were saying, that's the power that is there in that value.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. What was the question?
Well, it wasn't necessarily. It was the I guess the question here was what would we do? Like, what would you do? What would I do? And I think, and I was said basically like starting with helping people understand the value, and I guess that'd be part of it, right? Like, I think if I was a therapist in another life, I think that's in some ways what therapists do. They like uncover, get you to talk about your experiences, your history, the things you've been through, things you've experienced, and they can pick out, right, instances and make you face the thing that is causing you trauma and all those things, right? And I think this is, in a way, sort of similar, right? Because it's like, I need to go back and figure out and understand who you are and understand which value you're attaching to this bad outcome. So educating people on their history, where they come from, and through that, you'll discover where their value system lies. And then you can help them understand why that value is being misused. Probably a good way to put it, right?
Yes.
Because I think abusers actually, whether they're conscious or they're doing it consciously or subconsciously, they use that thing, right, as a source of power to abuse the person, right?
Usually, I think it would come from a place of needing to be needed, or needing to be useful, needing to be needed in one way or another. And so then you would draw your value from being in that position of they still need me.
Right.
They wouldn't be able to do this if they didn't have me. And so it's actually quite, I don't want to come across as judgmental, but it's arrogant. It is very arrogant.
We could be judgmental.
I can be this person's, right?
Yeah.
It is and we all have pride. We all have arrogance. And if anybody tells you that they don't, then they're full of it.
Right, yeah.
They're blind to it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think a lot of times it's not really so much about telling somebody who's in an abusive situation that this is the correct way to see it. I'm not saying that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
But a lot of times they need to know that they have value, inherent worth in who they are, but not just know it. They have to feel it.
Yeah.
They have to find it in themselves.
Yeah.
And that's why I said I think they have to get to a place of rock bottom, because they're going to continue to make those excuses. They're going to continue to apply these values in an incorrect way.
Right.
But when you get to the bottom of yourself and you realize I can no longer live this way, that's when things begin to change.
Right. And that's when you start setting appropriate boundaries.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Within yourself.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to do alone. And I think anybody that's coming out of an abusive situation, having a community, that's probably why church is really important for a lot of people, and they go to religion because you have a community there. Everybody wants to belong.
Yeah.
Like, we all want to belong to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And when you're in an abusive situation, you don't really have that. So that kind of fills that bucket, so to speak, of belonging.
Yeah.
And that helps create a cycle of worth because you feel a part of something. So,
right.
And then I think that's a good place to start, but you have to also make sure you don't get your worth also from just belonging into a group.
Right.
Because then you fit in, and I am valuable because I bring XYZ to the table, and it's not a bad thing. It's a very good step in moving in that right direction. But there's a quote by Maya Angelou that I love, and I'm probably going to botch it, but it's basically like we are most free when we belong nowhere and yet everywhere at once. but it's not a place. We belong to ourselves. That's basically what she's saying.
Mm-hmm.
So when you can have that sense of belonging because you have and know your worth in and of yourself, then you operate from a place, like a more healthy and full place.
Yeah.
And I think that happens when we develop our sense of self-worth based on God's love for our life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do you get somebody who's in an abusive situation to see that they are loved beyond measure?
Right.
And that is their source of strength to be able to live the life that they want to live.
Right.
So it's just a process. There's nothing one thing that can be said. They're all seeds that get planted along the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times you don't know when people are going through something like that.
Right.
You really don't.
Yeah, that is true. It is not easy to detect. Because would you say it's speaking of that, we're talking about boundaries, right? Not letting people in, right? Like there's people like so when I mentioned before, like, is there a such thing as inappropriate boundaries, or right? Because like when I think of boundaries, right? Like boundaries are like visually, it's like a wall you put up. Right. And walls keep things in, but they also keep things out.
Yeah.
Right. And so if a person, for instance, is in one of these situations that's terrible and they're setting up boundaries or walls, because I think culturally, when you hear the word boundary, we think it's a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, right? Mm-hmm. But if you just think about just what the word means, it's like, okay, well, there could be somebody trying to help you, but you're setting and putting up boundaries around them because you think that you're in one of these situations. You're like, oh, I value this person and I love them and I'm forgiving them and this is happening. And so you're like
protecting it, but you're actually sealing in the bad juju.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes, absolutely. I think so. You can set unhealthy boundaries.
Yeah.
A lot of that, though, I think would, in this case, be isolation. And you might be thinking it's a good boundary. It's a self-preservation boundary. But it's really not.
Right.
It's hard. It's very complex.
Yeah.
Because you have to be able to check in with yourself. And if you're lying to yourself every day to stay in an unhealthy situation, it's really hard to do that without separating.
Yeah.
It's so hard.
It is.
Huh. Bad boundaries. What are some bad boundaries?
Yeah.
Isolating yourself. What would be a bad boundary in your opinion?
Bad would be I think what comes to mind is a sense of closed-mindedness.
Yeah.
Right, like sort of a mental isolation. Not allowing people to, or here's probably a good one, right? Like or arrogance, right? Thinking that you're never wrong, right? Like,
is that a boundary though?
I think it can take the form of one, because I think the ethic at its core would probably be something like you're protecting yourself, right? Because in theory, we don't like being wrong as people, right? Like being wrong can really like have some real life consequences. You know what I mean? Like if you're wrong about I don't know, who to give money to, you know what I mean? Like, or, you know what I mean? Like, even when it's something that's not even direct, you know, that like something I do can have an impact or an effect on somebody else down the road. Like, I think when you have the kind of a mind that thinks sort of beyond yourself in that way, I think some people, depending on who you are, some people may be more thoughtful in that way than others. But if you're the type of person who thinks they're never wrong because you just think that you value the value of being right so much, right, then you'll set a certain boundary, which kind of goes back into like closed-mindedness in a sense, right? But you also shut yourself down or shut out being updated with new information, you know, be it existential or empirical, right? You set a boundary in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. You definitely would close yourself off to new ideas and new experiences that would challenge you, and that would not be good.
Right.
Because then how would you grow?
Right. Have you ever set a bad boundary?
I don't know. I have to think about it. Have I set a bad boundary?
Or a boundary you realize later wasn't a good thing? Because again, right, like it's like, I don't think people intentionally are around like, I'm setting a bad, like, I don't think people who are arrogant are just like, I'm arrogant. I think you can get to a place where you realize maybe I think when people say things like, when they admit being bad to, like, in some way, I think it's kind of tongue in cheek. It's like, people have told me this so much and I'm just going to embrace it now, which is a bad boundary. Like embracing bad things about yourself, that's just like not good.
Right.
And they're not good, but you just are embracing it just because.
Right, because it's too painful to not, or too harsh. I don't think I've set a bad boundary.
Or rather, a boundary that later you realize,
like, set a good boundary.
Right.
So being able to speak up for myself is something that takes practice.
What do you think was the core of that, not speaking up for yourself?
Not wanting to go against the grain, not wanting to be disliked, not wanting to like ruffle feathers, or it's not that important, Yeah. Something like that. I'm trying
to be like cunning and try to say like, oh, did you set that bad? Like for instance, like if you but the way you described it is you didn't set it, like you didn't just in your mind say, I didn't want to. I'm creating this boundary. I've in myself decided that not wanting to fit in or wanting to fit in is valuable, so valuable that I'm willing to not speak up because that will cause conflict with the people I'm in a circle with. But you can, right? Like, because I think that's like the essence of peer pressure in a way, right?
I was thinking high school,
for
sure.
Yep.
I was totally thinking high school. Like, in high school, you don't want to say the wrong thing or tell a bad joke or XYZ. I don't really see that as setting a boundary. I see that as not, I think this trying to fit in. And trying to fit in doesn't really have a good boundary system in place at all.
That's true. I can't think of a single, well, maybe I have to give it more thought, but I'm like, off the top of my head, I'm just like, when is that ever a good thing?
No, I think boundaries in general are not, some are set, like I will not murder somebody when I'm mad at them. Even if I want to flick their forehead, I'm not going to do that. But then there's just how much of myself am I willing to give and take? And I think that's a concept that allows for boundaries not to be super rigid. Because you have a lot of people out there that are like, this is my boundary. You're not going to talk to me like that ever. Like, and they put up these walls to protect, I don't know. I'm not that kind of person, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't think boundaries are just hard, set, and fast and immovable. I think that they are meant to be flexible to an extent until they begin to cross an internal boundary. And that internal boundary is like your compass, your North Star. And if that is poked and prodded and trampled, you have to say something.
Yeah.
You have to.
Yeah. Do you think? Here's an interesting question. Do you think there are some boundaries that you should set that should never change?
Yes. Name calling. I don't care how mad I am with somebody, I will never call them a name. And I expect the same. That's low blow. There's no reason for it. If I feel like I'm about to call somebody a name, I will walk away. Like that's a hard and fast boundary.
What would you say is the cornerstone of that boundary? So like if we think about boundaries as walls, like what's the central component or piece of that boundary, right?
Self-respect. Self-respect.
Mm-hmm.
I respect myself. I respect you as a person. I'm not going to reduce that value that you have to calling you a name.
Mm-hmm.
That is inappropriate in every way. And saying you're acting like a beep
Like, well, I didn't call you it.
is the same thing for the record.
I'm sure that's probably a good topic to probably. Well, I didn't call you it. Yeah, that's.
Just said you're acting like it. No, that's the same thing. That carries the same pack in that punch. So that is absolutely a no-go. No, none. Fighting, like learning how to resolve conflict and fighting fair in relationships is something that I think we should be taught in school. Because if you can't fight clean, you're going to have problems.
Yeah.
You got to learn how to fight clean.
Mm-hmm.
So.
That's a good concept.
Yeah.
Fighting clean. Yeah.
You got to fight. You're going to fight. You got to fight clean.
Yeah.
I believe we're out of time.
So that's a good concept to end on. She was paying attention to the hourglass. I have to hide it so that people don't know, so I can only see it. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
No, it's been a fantastic conversation. Hopefully everybody got something from that. It's been again, the first person to introduce the topic right on set. I had no clue what it was going to be.
I'm happy I did it.
And I think that went pretty well.
I think so.
We'll get you on another podcast for sure, because that was good. Maybe a boundaries part 2, maybe. Okay. I think we've talked about that. There may be some comments and things that people have that might bring up some interesting points of conversation. We can bring you back on, like somebody said this and I didn't think about it, and it stumped me. What do you think? Or it could be a completely different topic, but that was.
We could just spin off and talk about how do you know it's time to leave an unhealthy relationship.
Exactly. We could have definitely gone down that road for sure.
Yeah, and we don't ever want to have to do it again, but I'm grateful for it because I learned so much about myself and can say that, there is no way that it's going to go to waste. There's just no way. Yeah. I think our stories and our purpose are tied to the things and our pain that we go through and how we can get through that. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah.
Anywho.
I agree. Any final thoughts? You get the final thoughts in terms of just the overall topic? I guess what would be the thing that you say to the people if you were giving advice? You're not a therapist, like you said, but if you were giving advice or you were teaching someone.
Be okay with being alone. Take time to spend with yourself every single day. Check in with yourself every single day. Learn your voice that's inside of your head. And constantly pray that you can have discernment, internal discernment, and then I think naturally you'll be able to have a better grasp on where you stand, how to navigate life, how to set those boundaries, but it starts with spending time with yourself. Yeah.
There you have it. Kara, the advisor. If you need to reach out to her, go follow her on social media. I'm sure she'd be happy to give you a word of encouragement. She's said so many cool things tonight, and we've had conversations, and she's an awesome person, so I definitely encourage you guys to get to know her and follow her on social media. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in, as always. You know how we do it. Here to talk, have good conversations, discover some truth, debate a little bit if we need to. Like I always say, I'm always down for a good debate, because I think that is one of the ways of discovering truth. Clean fight. Fighting clean is a way that I'm going to use that in my conversation. You guys hold me to it. So thank you guys so much. Have a fantastic night. We'll see you at the next one.